Hello, everyone. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Nicole Fleetwood to the Cranbrook Academy of Art. So I'm going to start just with a brief introduction, and then I'm going to hand it off to you, Dr. Fleetwood. Dr. Nicole Fleetwood is a writer, curator, and professor of American Studies and Art at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. She is the author of Making Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which has been a finalist for the National Book Critics Award in Criticism and selected as Best Art Book of 2020 by the New York Times, Art News, and Art Newspaper. She's also the curator of the exhibition Marking Time, which is currently on view at MoMA's PS1 through April 4th, 2021, so you can still catch it. And that show has been called one of the most important art moments of 2020 by the New York Times and among the best art of 2020 by the New Yorker. Her other books are On Racial Icons, Blackness and the Public Imagination, and Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness. She's also co-editor of Aperture Magazine's Prison Nation issue, focusing on photography's role in documenting mass incarceration. And she's co-curator of Aperture's touring exhibition of the same name. Dr. Fleetwood has co-curated exhibitions and programs on art and mass incarceration at several institutions, including the Andrew Friedman Home, Aperture Foundation, Cleveland Public Library, Eastern State Penitentiary, MoMA's PS1, Mural Arts Philadelphia, the Zimmerli Art Museum, and the Urban Justice Center. Her work has been supported by the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the ACLS, Whiting Foundation, Denison Hill Residency, Schomburg Center for Scholars in Residence, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the NEH. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fleetwood.
Hi, thank you, Carla, for that introduction, and thank you to the community at Cranbrook for inviting me and welcoming me. I was saying earlier how I would love to be there because I can imagine how beautiful it is. I've never been to that part of Michigan, but hopefully when the time is right and things are safe, I can visit in person too. So I'm going to talk, as Carla said, from my current project, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And I really look forward to engaging you after my presentation. So, and I like to talk around images instead of reading from a paper. But one of the things I want to say in advance is that as I've worked on this project, for me, it is a project, and it's an ongoing project that's collaborative. It's not just a book. It's not just an exhibition. During Q&A, I would be, more than happy to talk to you about some of the other kind of programs and initiatives that have grown out of it that I might not be able to fit into a 45 or 50-minute lecture. But there's lots of things that are growing out of the project. And for me, that is made all the more meaningful and exciting how the project continues to grow and how it continues to be about a larger community of hundreds and hundreds of people who have participated or collaborated around it in some type of way. And I say that because the project started for me actually in in a very intimate way. And it started with me just spending time with a set of images of my incarcerated relatives and loved ones. And these were images that I have collected from prison visits and from letters and images sent to me by imprisoned loved ones over the course of more than a couple of decades. And it was when I finished my first book, Troubling Vision, that I felt like there was something missing in my scholarship and writing and just how I wanted to position myself in the world, that I felt like so much of what my family had experienced and what I had known growing up in Southwest Ohio was about punitive policing, the hyper incarceration, and long-term imprisonment of people in my community. And I felt like that was such a defining experience of how I saw the world, and yet I felt it invisible from my scholarship and a lot of the scholarship that was taking place at the time. And I have to say, from starting the project in 2010, 2011 to now, 10 years later in 2021, there's been so much incredible, robust work done around critical prison studies, abolition, collaboration across the carceral divide. I see my project as very much in conversation with a growing body of scholarship and activism. And I'm happy to be a participant and active in that larger movement. But I do want to show you that the kind of images that I started with. And I started by hanging these images around my apartment and really kind of engaging them instead of rendering them invisible as prisons had rendered my relatives invisible. I didn't want to do the same kind of thing by like not actually really engaging these images. And like, any student of fine art or visual culture, I started to train myself to do close readings of the image and to pay more attention to what was happening in the image besides my own emotional attachment to being separated from loved ones. This is my cousin Alan, who's a central figure in my life and definitely has inspired me to do this project. He was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 18, a few weeks after I graduated from college. And thankfully, after 21 years in prison, he was released. He's been out now for 6 years, and he's doing very, very well. But I just started paying more attention to what was happening in the image, like even thinking about the backdrops, and then started asking questions and learned that most of the backdrops are actually painted by imprisoned artists inside, whose job is to work in to create design or visuals or, to quote, beautify the prison space. And I also learned that the photographer who takes the picture is also an imprisoned person and is considered a highly sought after job. It's a job that goes to someone who is trusted by the prison staff, because the prison photographer actually interacts a lot with visitors and different kinds of audiences. So I just started asking more and more questions and learning. But I was still a little stuck about, like, I knew I was growing more and more interested in the visual culture and art making of prisons. And I want to say that part of the process too, that for me, around looking at these images that Alan sent me, it was also looking at the images that we were sending him. And I asked him while he was in prison to send me some of his favorite images. And this is one that really was deeply meaningful for him and also for me, because it's my grandmother's 9 daughters, and it was taken the year that she had died, and it was something that Alan kept taped to his wall, and it just an image that really connected him to the family, even though prisons had physically removed him. But what I want to say is that when I started to think more and more about the visual culture and art making of prisons, I was still a little stuck methodologically about how to go about this project, because I wasn't sure how to get access to art making in prison. I mean, I had relatives in prison who didn't define themselves as artists, but they were surrounded by arts making. And I should say art making in prison is so voluminous, so much so that when I told Alan I wanted to do this project, he laughed. He's like, "How are you going to do that? Everybody in prison is an artist." He was, and what I come to learn is that there are probably, hundreds of thousands of people who are engaged in some type of art making, given the over 2.3 million people who are in prison. So not knowing how to really get access to the art making that was taking place in prison, I started by thinking about the visual culture around mass incarceration through images, through photographs taken by non-incarcerated artists. And it led me to just doing research of the history of prison photography, from mug shots. Like, this is one of the earliest collections of mugshots is stored actually at the Missouri History Museum. And, and it's also a really important kind of counter archive to thinking about the history of photography, because, very early on in photography's advent, it gets used as a way of classifying, collecting, and holding people captive in various ways. We know it was used for, as colonial projects, but it's also definitely very early on used as a part of a penal carceral project. And so I just want to show you some of the earlier images that I was working with as I started to try to figure out how to get access to more of the art making that takes place inside the visual world inside a prison. And I connected with Bruce Jackson, who's a documentarian out of SUNY, I think Binghamton, and for over 50 years he's been doing video, film, and audio recordings of prisons in the South, especially prisons that exist on former slave plantations. And a lot of these prisons throughout the South, they're called penal farms. They're still agrarian-based carceral facilities where imprisoned people often have to work, as farm hands for little, if any, wages. And he had to come across through his work at Cummins Prison Farm in Arkansas, this early set of prison ID photos. And I just wanted to show you a couple of them that really captivated me, and I ended up writing about them in Marking Time in a chapter that I dedicated to photographs and portraits of incarcerated people. And then I, got more familiar with some contemporary projects like Deborah Luster, who since the late 90s has been documenting, usually through these kind of exquisite portraits of imprisoned people in Louisiana. And Louisiana is a place of significance within the carceral state, because it's often called the punishment capital or the prison capital of the world. There are per capita, in terms of a number of people that get imprisoned there, largely Black men and women, and for excessively long sentences. And another photographer who's been committed to documenting that, especially the toll that Louisiana prisons take on Black populations, is Keith Calhoun, with his wife and co-photographer Chandra Mccormick. And so since the early 80s, they've been especially focusing on Angola, which is the largest maximum security prison in the world. That's notorious, built on an 18,000 acres of former slave plantation, where for hundreds of years it has been a place where people have been brutalized, tortured, and forced to work, agrarian labor through chattel slavery, and also through the punitive logics of state and local governments. And this is another one of their images. Chandra Mccormick and Keith Calhoun often work together. And then as I got more and more into the research and started connecting with organizations that ran art programs in prisons, I started to learn about collaborative projects. And one of the collaborative photo projects that many of you might know about, because it's at this point has gotten a lot of attention, is a project that was kind of co-initiated by Lori Jo Reynolds, who's a socially engaged artist and professor teaching at University of Illinois in Chicago, and collaborated with a group of directly impacted people, families of imprisoned people, lawyers, and local activists to close a supermax prison in Illinois. And supermax prisons are prisons that exist solely to keep people in isolation. So they're one of the most punitive forms of captivity and punishment known to modern humanity. And through their advocacy, they engaged photographers to volunteer and collaborate with people who were in prison in these supermax prisons to envision a world or an image or photograph that they are not actually able to see in supermax. And so this artist, this imprisoned man, asked for a picture of himself on a blue sky because all he had was his prison ID photo. And to me, these images are really significant because they really begin like a kind of collaborative vision of abolition of a world without prison that only can take place when imprisoned people and non-imprisoned people dream together to create that world. So it's through my research into photo practices that I started to connect with organizations like the William James Association that's been around since 1977 in California. And the William James Association is an organization that's dedicated to bringing art to people in prison in the state of California. And like I said, they've been running continuously since 1977, one of the longest running organizations. I met Ronnie Goodman, who was a formerly incarcerated artist at San Quentin, became a really established painter and portrait artist. And this work by him, San Quentin Arts and Corrections Art Studio, opens my book, and it actually closed the exhibition, and I'll tell you why in a little later. But this image became so significant for me because it really became a portal for me to see a world that I can't see as a non-incarcerated person. And what it opens up for me are like the conditions under which people in prison are creating. And from studying this image and studying a series of images by imprisoned artists, I came up with these categories of analyses. And I knew that I wanted to bring a type of rigor to art made in prison that wasn't kind of reliant on historical or conventional ways that prison art gets talked about. And often prison art will get talked about through these categories of either folk art or outsider art. And I knew that, not that I don't think that those are important categories, but I knew I didn't want those type of categories to frame my approach because I wanted to think about, in a sustained way, about how art making in prison is very much a response to not being outside of institutions, but being held within the belly of institutions. So I wanted to think about that relationship to one's aesthetic horizons, one's access to materials, and the very institution that's shaping one's horizons and what one can see, one's sensory experience. And so I came up with some categories like carceral aesthetics, which is a term I use throughout the book and throughout the project, as the condition of art making under the status of unfreedom. But I also talk about it more expansively to think about how carceral aesthetics can encompass the work by artists like Sabo Ely Smith, who's a non-incarcerated artist, a professor at Columbia Fine Arts, but has been doing work for many years about how prisons fragment Black family life and intimacy, or someone like Cameron Rowland or Titus Kaffar. These are all very established, award-winning non-incarcerated artists who are deeply engaged in practices of exploring mass incarceration and captivity. Maria Gaspar being another person who teaches at teaches at the Art Institute of Chicago and appears in the book as well. So carceral aesthetics is one of the categories. And then as I was thinking about like, well, okay, I have this broad category, this broad rubric, then what are the kind of conditions of art making in captivity, and what shapes the experience of art making? And I use these three categories throughout, and they are penal matter, and that's like the material constraints. In most prisons, in prison, people can't just go to an art supply store and buy whatever materials they want. So some places will allow artists to order through magazines or commissary lists, but the access is very limited. For example, they can't use paints that have metals in them, or there's just a certain cutting devices and the like. So it really constrains what they can do. And so they often improvise or experiment. So that's what penal matter is. And then I talk about penal time, which is both the experience of one sentence. Our modern system of punitive governance punishes people through time. And that in itself is kind of like a wild concept, you know, that it's like a human construct that we use time to punish people. It really becomes a very important management tool for imprisoned artists to use that time as punishment and turn it into time for art making. So it's a way of kind of refuting the mandate of the state to live 10 years as a punished subject, or to use 15 years, you know, experience 15 years as such. So it's a way of working with that. And then penal space, and that's the built environment. That's art rooms like this, the cells where people make art, but it's also how prisons structure social relationships, intimate relationships, and psychic relationships, even to oneself, which I think is really beautifully encapsulated in terms of think about psychic space in this work by Tamika Cole, made during her 26 years in prison in Alabama. And this was in response to some abuse that she was experiencing by prison staff. And she said, you know, her instinct, which was to respond out of anger, would have just led to like a harsher punishment, a longer sentence, being thrown in a hole. And so in the actual making of this work, she describes it very powerfully and beautifully. She was actually creating a space for her own survival. She was creating this kind of calm space through this kind of circular graphite motion. And then I want to just show you some examples of penal matter. So as I said, for me, I got completely obsessed with this idea of penal matter and how imprisoned artists innovate with whatever found objects they can acquire, how they will use contraband from parts of the prison, how they will use organic matter at the service of art making. And Dean Gillespie, who I met Dean actually through my cousin Alan. They became really good friends in prison. And Dean spent his 20 years in Ohio prison, you know, fighting he was wrongfully convicted, which throughout the book, I don't focus on why someone's in prison, but for him, it was very important for me to know that he was wrongfully convicted. And he actually is the inaugural person to be released by the Ohio Innocence Project. But his wrongful conviction became crucial to how he would strategize to art making, because he said that the state was stealing years of his life. And so he was what he called procuring materials from the state to make art. So for example, this dinette called Spitz dinette, and most of his works are named Spitz, which is a nickname his father gave him. He used what looks like the rivets that hold the dinette together, actually sewing needles that were confiscated from the sewing room inside the prison. And he was able to take different little pieces of wood from the wood shop space. The window curtain is actually a used tea bag. So it's, you know, it's just all these ways that he's like taking materials from different parts of the prison to also manage penal time, to manage the time until he was released. Another example, and this is the use of textiles is something you see often in prison art. So especially when artists have like very limited access to canvases and other type of like backdrops, but also it can be used in mixed media work like Gilberto Rivera's An Institutional Nightmare, where he takes his state issued clothing and also mixes in forms, commissary forms. Actually, you see the warden's signature on one of these forms, which becomes then a part of his art making. He worked, his job in prison was to mop floors. So you see floor wax being brought in. And this was a work that he then gifted to another incarcerated artist, Jesse Crimes. They were part of a multiracial art collective that formed in Ferriton, which I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. Another example of penal matter, which you'll see often in prison art, is the use of food wrappers or wrappers from snacks and the like, discarded material. Kenneth Reams, who's currently in prison in Arkansas and was sentenced to death row at the age of 18. He's been in solitary confinement on death row since the mid-90s, has used that time to become an activist partly who's critiquing the business of punishment and all the industries that benefit from punishing and imprisoning people. And this is a work that he made, a collage that he made by asking fellow people on death row to just empty their trash bins and let him use the wrappers to make art with a political critique. This work is called Capitalization. So it's about, again, literally the business of punishment and the extractive practices of charging people in prison and their loved ones exorbitant rates for this for goods that would be sold outside of prison at much lower rates. When I talk about penal matter, I'm talking about like the materiality of prison and the access to items or art supplies, but I'm also talking about something conceptual, and this conceptual category for me actually emerges through the work of imprisoned artists and I'm learning from. So in this project, I'm a student. The teachers are the people who are making art in prison. And James Hoff is someone who was in prison for 27 years in Pennsylvania. He was released August of 2019 and is also just a brilliant political theorist, just one of the smartest people I've ever met, and who did a lot of work thinking about all of the industries and all of the people and entities and towns that rely literally on warehousing people. And warehousing, especially Black and Latinx men. And I Am the Economy emerged as part of that critique. It's part of a 3-part triptych water series critiquing the prison industrial complex. Now, in terms of thinking about time, I was talking about penal time as also an important category. And so it's artists kind of theorize and visualize penal time in a number of ways. And for me, one of the most captivating ways is by linking prison time, penal time, to the long history of Black subjugation. Jared Owens did such kind of theorization and visualization in his work, Elapsium, where the title itself tells you partly the logic behind the painting, the triptych. He has taken the Brooks slave ship that art historian Cheryl Finley writes beautifully about in her book, Committed to Memory. The Brooks slave ship was an icon of abolition that emerged around 1787. It was used by abolitionists in Britain to pictorialize the horrors of slavery by showing kind of people held captive in holding cells in this image. And then it came to the US and also became an abolitionist image here. Cheryl Finley writes about how over the past 2.5 centuries, artists, especially Black artists, have returned to that, the Brooks slave ship as an icon and use it in their art. Like Hank Willis Thomas has a well-known work that uses that. And there are many, many artists kind of return to this image. Here, Jared has done something quite innovative, has taken the Brooks slave ship and on top of it has projected the blueprint for Ferreton Prison where he was incarcerated and has lined up the prison cells of the cells of the prison with the holding cells of the slave ship. And then he's incorporated to kind of bring texture and offer another dimension of color, he's incorporated soil from the prison yard. And color is very symbolic for him in all of his work. Orange especially, orange is just a color in federal prisons that is a warning symbol. So it's an image, it's a sign of where imprisoned people cannot enter. And to enter into orange is at one's own risk. It could lead to being thrown in a hole. It could lead to one's death even. So for him, he said he's been released from prison, I think, and he was released in 2013, 2014. He said orange is still like this color that produces a lot of anxiety in him. Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter, and what you'll see that throughout the book and the exhibition and the ongoing project, that there's just a range of media and genres and traditions that artists are pulling upon. Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter is a sound artist. She's an incredible rapper, now based in Philadelphia. In her triptych, which is available on YouTube if you want to at some point Google it, it's called Ain't I a Woman? It's a 15-minute video that she sonically narrates, very powerful rap, but also incredible visuals that also is an study of penal time. And here she's thinking about, through the title, Ain't I a Woman, connecting to Sojourner Truth, who, is a 19th century abolitionist suffragist who goes around giving lots of speeches, and one well-known speech is Ain't I a Woman, where she's talking about the particularities of the violence and captivity and struggles of Black womanhood. And so Mary carries that message through to this video she makes in 2018 that is reimagining of her experience of horror, and that is 43 hours being shackled in prison while she's in labor giving birth to her son. It's a really, really powerful video, and a powerful kind of narration about what she calls not the school to prison pipeline, but the prison to prison pipeline, where she says the experience of Black people in this continent has been one of dealing with forms of imprisonment. Now, I'm going to just shift in direction a little bit to talk about some of the importance of one of the things that I learned, again, as being a student to like the artists who are willing to teach me about the really robust art making that takes place in prison, is I had no idea going into this project how important portraiture is to the visual world of prisons, how portraits serve so many different purposes, and how they are a big collector's item among imprisoned artists. So, so one of the ways that portrait art works in prison is that people are often commissioned by someone who's really good at drawing. A lot of the portraits are graphite portraits, and there's an entire economy that circulates in prisons around buying and selling and trading portraits. And often prison staff will commission a really talented portrait artist to make a portrait of their loved one or of a celebrity. And then there's also some really interesting experimental ways that artists are innovating around portraits. And this series by Jesse Crimes, Purgatory, it was made during his first year in prison, where he was in solitary confinement and had very limited access to art supplies. Jesse was an artist prior to going to prison. And what he did is he turned to newspapers, prison newsletters, legal documents, where he first started working with mugshots, and then later just with a broader spectrum of headshots, including celebrities. If you look like on the fourth line, there's Bill Gates appears in one of them. So there's different kind of a morphing of people who've been stigmatized with the mugshot and very well-known figures. And so what he did is he took these images in newspapers and magazines and transferred them onto prison bars of soap. And so as time, over time, the images fade, the material, the kind of organic matter breaks down, but you still have this kind of striking and harrowing collection of these kind of haunted figures. Lizette Oblitas was involved in self-portrait work, and part of her self-portrait, another category that I don't invoke, but I use it when artists talk about it is like kind of therapeutic art. So I don't talk about any of this work through the category of like therapeutic arts, but for Lizette, it was really important for her to self-narrate around her relationship to art making and therapy, in part because of how she ended up in prison through a fatal car accident that she had initiated, that she was found guilty of, and a person in a car in front of her died as a result of that car accident. And Lizette got very close to the family of the deceased over the time in prison. And this was a work that she did, a self-portrait, where she actually merges her face with the elderly woman who died in the car accident. And she said this was a transformative experience for her because part of what art making allowed was her to forgive herself, but also to really kind of honor the life of this person who died at the hands of a car accident that she caused. Another self-portrait that is, again, kind of working against the grain of the punitive logics of prison is Russell Craig's, this is a large painting, by the way, self-portrait, where he actually takes this image, his prison ID card that he has to wear on his body, like as a stigma. Literally, all incarcerated people have to wear these images. And he said he just changed his identification from, quote, inmate to artist through the actual making of this work. Other ways that portraits show up, I think that's very powerful for me in the lives of incarcerated artists, is through letter writing. A lot of artists will write a letter to a loved one or to a friend and will actually enfold portraits into the letter itself. And this is done by James Hoff, who was a friend of Russell Craig and sent it to Russell Craig once Russell was released from prison. Russell also works with Penal Matter in his self-portrait. So he takes prison documents and uses them as the backdrop for a lot of his work. So this is a 10-foot by 8-foot self-portrait that he made when he was on parole, once he was released from prison. And it is an accumulation of like sentencing documents, review board papers, all kinds of legal documents that keeps him tethered to the state. And for him to collect that material was powerful in and of itself, and then to turn it into this like large scale presentation of self once released, for him also he talks about as something quite transformative. George Anthony Morton is another portrait artist. I'm just going through some of the wide range of styles of portrait making inside prison too. And George is very interesting. He actually runs an atelier in Atlanta. He went to federal prison for 10 years, where he turned that experience into one of just deep dive art training, a lot of it self-guided through reading art instruction books, and emerged a really accomplished portrait artist, so much so that his first year after being released from prison, he was accepted into the Florence Academy, was able to get released from parole and go to Italy, and was awarded the best portrait of the year for this work he did, Mars. So I also talk about the history of portraiture around, as you know, as a practice of memorialization, and it's even more that sense of memorialization is even more heightened within prison art making practices. So this self-portrait here actually opens one of the chapters of my book, chapter 6. Which is another chapter I had no idea I was going to write. It was a chapter that's solely about art making in solitary confinement. It's actually the last chapter that I wrote because what I ended up doing was taking different stories of solitary confinement from other parts of the book and putting it together in one chapter. And I did that because I realized as I was going through my edits is that so many people had talked about solitary confinement. And it is just one of the areas of incarceration that often gets overlooked by the public, but it's so harrowing, and so the torture and the long-term ramifications of solitary confinement is something that we all should be aware of. And also the fact that there's a lack of transparency, meaning that in the United States, on any given day, there could be 80 to 100,000 people in solitary confinement. It's very hard to keep track of, in part because there's all these different ways of coding solitary confinement as protective custody or management control or administrative segregation, or so all these ways that the actual torture of what's happening, someone being held in a cell by themselves for 23 to 24 hours a day, gets obfuscated. And I opened chapter 6 with this portrait by Billy Sell, who died while in solitary confinement during, as a participant in a hunger strike in California, to bring attention to the cruelties of solitary confinement. And it was through working with Tracy Ziegler, who's a volunteer art teacher out of the Ithaca area, that I became aware of Billy Sell, because she had taught him through correspondence courses. He was not allowed out of his cell to do regular programming in prisons, but he participated in this correspondence art course where she would send supplies and send instruction, and he would draw and mail his drawings to her. So this is a self-portrait he did some months before he died. I'm going to show you some of the other works that are emerging out of solitary confinement. Here's a really powerful drawing by Cornell Hunnicutt, who was at the time in a supermax cell in Connecticut, just depicting with exactitude the austerity of that built environment that many architects actually refuse to participate in, because there's been, this coalition of architects who refuse to build solitary confinement prisons because their only purpose of existing is actually to torture and to diminish the life expectancies of a person. Another kind of example of art making in solitary confinement is the political collage work of Ojuri Lutalo, who's a member of the Black Liberation Army, the radical revolutionary Black movement that Assata Shakur is probably most famously associated with. And when Ojuri was incarcerated in New Jersey, he was held in, they called it administrative segregation, for 22 years. It was really solitary confinement, and they put him in solitary confinement to keep him away, his political ideas isolated from the general population. So during that time, he connects with the American Friends Service Committee Prison Watch Program and become good friends with the program director, Bonnie Kernis, and they start to collaborate together across this, prison divide to get his political collages out of prison. And she uses them in her advocacy work to end solitary confinement and long-term imprisonment. And since his release in 2009, he now works with Bonnie for the Prison Watch program, continuing to do this work around bringing awareness to the suffering that takes place in solitary confinement. I don't have a lot of video in the book or in the exhibition, but there's one project that I do write about, and it's called an Omar Broadway film, and it's about, it's a film based on this contraband video camera that Omar Broadway and Douglas Terrell, I'm sorry, not Doug, and Buddy Randolph bring into a prison in New Jersey, where they're in a isolated unit for people who've been labeled gang members. And what we learned through their video, their contraband video, is that it's a place that houses almost exclusively Black and Latinx men. It doesn't matter whether people identify with the gang or not, if the state labels one a gang member, one's isolated there. And what they experience is just nonstop violence with the prison staff assaulting them with such regularity that one scene of violence just blurs and it bleeds into another. And if any of you follow any kind of like either in New Jersey or prison conditions, you will have heard that the incidents of violence, especially in the state of New Jersey, prisons are so rampant that just this week a report came out about the brutal assaults on women at the Mayhem prison for women there in New Jersey, so much so that one woman ended up like bound to a wheelchair. So this kind of ongoing violence continues throughout state and federal prisons. I'm going to transition now. I see it's 5:45, so I want to wrap up in the next 5 to 7 minutes. And I'm going to wrap up by showing you, I'm showing you images that come from the book, and I wanted to show you how some of that work then gets installed, translates into an art exhibition. And so this is on the outside wall of PS1, where you have Ojuri Lutalo's collages. We pasted there, and we wanted to do it in kind of also honoring like street art and political art, which is very much the kind of legacy and the tradition that he was producing into. And it's also for us really symbolic, because when many of the artists, formerly imprisoned artists, came to PS1 during install and once the show opened, they all reflected on how the exterior walls around PS1 are very much akin to a prison yard. So thinking about the relationship between the architecture of PS1, which used to be a public school, prisons, and also museum sites. We commissioned a new work by Sable Lee Smith, who, again, I told you likes to is a conceptual artist who does incredible work thinking about how prisons fragment Black communities and Black family life. Much of her work is sculptural and also incorporates text. She also has chapbooks where she does a lot of kind of poetic thinking and writing. So this is the first work you see when you enter the lobby space. And then I'm just going to walk you through quickly the signage. And then one room that's dedicated to a collage series, a portrait series that I haven't spoken about yet, but it's the cover of the book. And it's by Mark Lafney, called Pyrrhic Defeat, a visual study of mass incarceration. He started it in 2014. He's still currently in prison. He actually just recently recovered from COVID, which you probably know a lot of prisons are COVID hotspots, and thankfully he's fine. But over his 6.5 years working on this series, he's amassed over 700 portraits. These are all 20-minute, they're also performance-based, which I love. He asked other imprisoned people to sit for a 20-minute sketch, and these are the results. He's continued this work during the pandemic, so these are some of his most recent works, which incorporate fellow imprisoned people in masks. From there, and there's only, because of COVID restrictions, there's only one way to kind of circle the gallery space. There's 8 rooms. I think there's about 8,000 square feet. It's a really large exhibition. And at the center of this room, you see some of the miniatures by Dean Gillespie. I spoke about Gilberto Rivera's work, Jared Owens, and then this dual projected video by an abolitionist artist and scholar, Ashley Hunt, who teaches at Cal Arts. And it's a really powerful video on the history, present, and future of Rikers Island, which is a penal colony, one of the largest jails in the country, that activists have been fighting for many years to have it closed as part of the Close Rikers campaign. Another view from that room. I'm gonna just move a little faster. This is another work by Jesse Crimes, who did the portraits on the prison slope. And it's a large scale mural that he did over a 3-year period on prison bed sheets. So these are 39 prison bed sheets. He'd create a panel, and then he'd have to find a way of sneaking it out of prison. And he did this over 3 years and wasn't able to see the work together until he was released from prison. The images are taken from magazines, especially like the New York Times magazine, and then he draws and sketches on top of it, and also incorporates some paint. But it's his kind of thinking about political theory and social valuation. So it's these levels, you know, it's a 3-tier system of hell, earth, and heaven. More examples of kind of Penal Matter. This is a room that really captivates people. People spend a lot of time in, where you have these 6-pronged sculptures. One, the blue and gray by Sable Lee Smith, and then the one with the food trays made by Daniel McCarthy Clifford. Daniel is a formerly incarcerated artist. This to me is a great example of carceral aesthetics. They were working from very different places. Sable having, you know, been through art school and very much an accomplished artist. Daniel having emerged out of federal prison and then later goes to art school. He gets accepted into a BFA program and just recently graduated with an MFA from the University of Minnesota. And they're working conceptually in various ways. These are more photographs from Keith Calhoun and Chandra Mccormick I mentioned to you earlier. A really incredible, powerful installation by Roland Renee called No Spirit for Me. And Roland just had an interview actually about this project in Aperture online blog, which I'll post in chat when I'm done with this presentation, because it's a really compelling interview about how Roland uses their father's criminal records to do some healing work, both personally and also thinking about kind of transformative justice and abolition through the use of these materials. This is a room that puts Russell Craig's portraits in conversation with his art mentor from prison, James Hoff. A very powerful room I'm happy to talk more about. And then I just want to show you kind of the final images. We have works from this collective out of South Florida called Women on the Rise, and it's a collective of women artists who work with incarcerated girls and women in the Miami-Dade area. On the back wall are photographs from Sarah Bennett, who is a photographer who photographs women sentenced to life or long-term imprisonment, and also once women have been released. And she went from being a criminal defense attorney to becoming a photographer. We have these great works by American artists that engages with the Blue Lives Matter movement as this kind of counter anti-Black force that is also quite militarized. So combining also the kind of police training with militarism. And then in the back wall, you'll see more portraits by Ronnie Goodman, who I opened the presentation with. And this is a wall dedicated to Ronnie Goodman. And I wanted to end on this because Ronnie Goodman is a central figure in the exhibition in the book. And once he was released from prison, was an unhoused person for about a decade in the San Francisco Bay Area, and sadly passed away in August of 2020, partly made more vulnerable by the pandemic, and all the resources and organizations that used to help support him, having been closed during the pandemic, made his life even more precarious. So it's really important for me that all my presentations honor him and his art and life. So I'm going to stop here, and I welcome all your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. That was really fascinating, moving, important, amazing. And Marking Time seems to have a plethora of spectacular images in the book as well. So thank you for sharing those. We do have one question to kick us off from Alex. Your work centers around the U.S. prison industrial complex. Have you done any research of different countries?
Yes,
and is this something you're interested in?
Yeah, my work focuses on the U.S. prison system, which you can see is vast and complex in its own right. And I have collaborated with, I did a conference at Rutgers where we had people coming in internationally. I've been in conversation with people who are doing research in Argentina and South Africa, Mexico. So I'm in conversation with artists and scholars, internationally, but I'm specifically focused on US prisons, which I think is a big enough topic.
Yeah. We have time for more Q&A in the window. Let's see if that question is done.
And while you're pulling up that, or while people are composing questions, I want to share this this interview with Roland Renee that I mentioned, because it is a really powerful. Roland's a really interesting artist who what I shared was actually their MFA project that they did while finishing up at University of Michigan in 2019.
And we do have a couple. So you're sharing that.
I'm just going to put it in the chat for anyone interested in learning more about Roland's work.
Okay, great. Now we have, thank you. I see the link now. We do have a couple of questions pending. One's in the chat and one's in the Q&A. I think we're trying to keep them in the Q&A.
Okay.
But I'll go with the one that's in the chat from JCL, who says, wow, that was amazing.
Thank you.
My question is, what are your thoughts on the relation between the work about incarceration from those the relation between those formerly incarcerated and those that have never been incarcerated? Are there any cautions about approaching art about incarceration from those never incarcerated?
I think that is a really great question, and I appreciate it so much. It was something I spent a lot of time thinking about, so much so that chapter 5 of the book is called Fraught Imaginaries, and it's about collaborations between imprisoned artists and non-imprisoned artists. To think about the power dynamics and some of the kind of institutional logics that go into that type of collaboration, and how sometimes those collaborations, while might be, filled with good intentions, can reproduce certain kind of forms of inequality if questions are not asked kind of going in around challenging kind of the structural logics of who's in prison and who's not in prison, and just really thinking carefully about mobility and access to resources, and if some people are financially benefiting from these projects and other people aren't. So it is something I've given a lot of thought to, and I have to say that chapter 5, in some ways was the most difficult for me to write, because I wanted to be clear-minded, to be honest, but also to do no harm to organizations that are often, doing really important and hard work. I also just shared another link, and it's a link to Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter's video that I had mentioned earlier. Oh,
great. Yeah, I was super curious about that one. So we have another question, and this question also, I spent some time at the University of Pennsylvania and lived in Philly, and I noticed that you have the Eastern State Penitentiary as one of the institutions that you were involved with. And this kind of relates to Chris's question. Is there a specific time period that you focus on? Do you have any thoughts of exploring historical incarcerated art?
Yeah, and so I focus on what we call the era of mass incarceration, which is often people talk about it kind of from this, some people talk about it 80s onward, but a lot of people will go to the late 60s and 70s, especially with the hyper imprisonment of Black political activists, kind of creating certain structures that led to the imprisonment of larger populations of Black people. So my project is very much connected to the era of mass incarceration, to think about how the prison boom has also led to an art boom inside of prisons. But I say very early on in the introduction that the history of captivity, the history of people being held in prison, is also the history of people making art about prison. That, whenever people are held captive, they are envisioning, they're dreaming, they're creating, they're working towards a world where they're not held as captive subjects, or a moment where they're not held as captive subjects.
Great. Oh, I got a note that people can't see your links.
I think I sent the links to panelists. Let me just.
Yeah, I'll do that. No, I'll do that.
Okay.
I can copy them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You can focus on the questions. We have a juicy one from Marianne, which is, do you collaborate with therapists or social workers to bring insight into the work as part of their therapeutic care?
As I said, I don't frame my work as therapeutic art. I'm an art historian, but many of the artists are involved in organizations that are doing art-based therapy, or they see their work as therapeutic. And some of the organizations that I've interviewed are involved in like art therapy programs. My lens is through abolition. And I think focusing on therapy for individuals in a system that is fundamentally unjust puts the burden on individuals, and not the fact that the institution itself needs to be completely overturned.
Thank you. Ted has a question. I'm interested in understanding any formal presentation of penal time in an effort to understand its difference or differences from the concept of time under capitalism more generally as a measurement of the commodification of human labor. In short,
okay.
Is there a way artists make visible this difference?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question, and I think that prisons function under the logic of racial capitalism. So there's definitely a linkage between prisons and capitalism, and the fact that so many prisons operate off of the extractive labor of imprisoned people, again, connects it to capitalism. But I thought it was important to just have a sustained kind of thought experiment around what is a sentence as a measurement of one's punishment, and what it means to spend every second or every millisecond, or however you can break down time to its smallest increment of being measured, as punishment. So when an imprisoned person wakes up, they're being punished. When they brush their teeth, they're being punished. When they're eating, they're being punished. When they're showering, they're being punished. So that entire experience of being held in a box for, 1 year to life is just, both physical, psychic, and, and I think also a deeply existential experience of time.
Thank you. And Ted also says thank you. And I just want to share his comments. He says, you're a very, very savvy presenter, and I enjoyed this presentation very much, despite its occasion, of course.
Oh, thank you.
Nellie has a question. I really appreciate the way you frame time as a human construct and go on to demonstrate how it's used as a form of punishment in the prison industrial complex. Can you share more about this philosophy?
I think I answered some of that with, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the way you talk about time, I think it's really, really fascinating, and how time is formed and the construct of meeting it out. Gretchen has a comment. Amazing lecture, thank you. And this is a question that I had as well. The exhibition looks incredible. How difficult is it to get these works and make them so public? Are the prisons cooperative, or are there certain facilities, organizations that really help facilitate?
That's a great question. And as you were asking it, I was just thinking more about time, because it's like, it seems like a lot of the art students are thinking about time. And I think being, pandemic time is making people kind of just more conscious of, often we kind of take time for granted, right? But when you're forced to limit when your activities are limited because of constraints, right? And pandemic time is not prison time. People have tried to make these equations between lockdown and prison, but I think it does give people a sense of what it feels like when, you know, we take for granted non-incarcerated people, this idea of like having some quote ownership over time. I think one of the things that prison art can do in interesting ways, especially for art practitioners, is to rethink what is a time-based medium, because we often talk about film as a time-based medium, right? Well, I mean, if you talk to all artists in prison, all of their practices are time-based. It's literally how they're managing penal time and trying to reassert some kind of creativity and autonomy when they've lost freedom. So autonomy is a kind of making of a miniature when the state is mandating that you stay locked away in the cell, right? So there's all these kind of really thoughtful ways that time gets deployed and kind of reconfigured. So the artist Jared Owens, who did the painting Elapsium, where he's using the Brooks slave ship, he became an abstract painter, and he said he moved to abstraction because he wanted to not think about his sentence list. So he said he intentionally lost track of days. He intentionally lost track of time as a way of not just being filled with rage by this kind of excessive punitive sentence he got. And so that's what I wanted to say to that question a little more. Now, one of the really exciting things to me about the exhibition is that it really allowed the project to grow more and more collaborative. And there are works that are in the book that don't appear in exhibition, and vice versa. And so the exhibition really started to take shape after the book was already in production. And so as I continued to meet new artists and learn about other practices, I was able to kind of expand that vision through the exhibition. And we get the works in a number of ways. Many of the artists, I would say about probably 2/3 of the artists are currently or formerly in prison, and maybe 1/3 are socially engaged artists who are doing work around prisons, but they've never been incarcerated. And out of those 2/3 of artists, a lot of them are no longer incarcerated. It's also been interesting to watch over the course of working on this project. 3 of them have been released. They were in prison when we started working on the exhibition. Now they're out. And also over the 10 years of working on the book, several people were released. And so some of the work is easy to get because people are not in prison, or they are exhibiting artists who have galleries. The work that was much more complex to manage and to facilitate were like the Pyrrhic Defeat series, the 700 portraits by Mark Lotney. And his mother is a great ally. So he sends the work to her. She has them transported to the museum. And that installation has actually grown over the life of the exhibition. We've added more of the portraits. And we've also collaborated with organizations like the Justice Arts Coalition. This is was a volunteer-run organization. Now it's turned into a nonprofit that does a lot of facilitating of art making and advocacy to imprisoned people. And 7 of the artists who are members of the Justice Arts Coalition are also on the show. And that was facilitated through Wendy Jason, who's the director of the organization, and also a great ally of the show and the project.
Apologies, I was muted for a minute there. Now we have a question from Ed. I actually got to see the exhibition of PS1 in January. Jealous. which was amazing. Could you talk a bit more about the curatorial challenge of using the exhibition as a way to illustrate realities about incarceration that are hard to understand, like time?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it was something we gave a lot of thought to. And so the didactics and the wall text come from the book, but it's been adopted to have for audiences who are in museums and who might be, might look at a description for like 2 minutes as opposed to read a book and spend hours on it. So we had to think about like how to really kind of crystallize complex ideas into like a few sentences or a phrase here and there. And that, thankfully, was work that I did in collaboration with the curatorial staff at PS1. So in terms of just working to take certain theoretical concepts and figure out how to translate that to a public, and also knowing that, when most people, when they read books, I mean, some people jump around from chapter to chapter, but they're kind of building off of chapters. And with the exhibition, people, might spend more time at one work than another. It's not necessarily a kind of a linear experience. So those were all things that we were thinking about as we tried to get, make sure that the political stakes of the project were communicated through the exhibition.
I have a couple of provocative questions from an anonymous attendee. Is the distinction between art and craft represented in incarcerated art education programs?
I mean, I appreciate that question. And I think that distinction matters for some people. It's not a distinction that I don't put any emphasis in. So I think that there are, in a lot of prisons, they have like what they call crafts rooms. And they don't often call them art rooms, but in some places they do have like more programs that are considered crafts. That might involve like working with, like crocheting is popular in prison, especially women's prisons, but also popular in men's prisons. And I really, in the project, work to like challenge those categories of like high art and folk art, or craft and fine art, like as part of my intellectual and political practice is to not get stuck in those kind of hierarchies, or not invest in those hierarchies.
So the other question is, on a personal note, how has engaging with this topic as an art historian and researcher changed your personal relationship to imprisoned people and the carceral state in your own life?
Yeah, it's been transformative. Like my community has expanded tremendously as a result. My sense of like what's possible has expanded. The ways that imprisoned artists will often work. One of the things I felt to say as I was talking, but that became like a central idea that I learned from imprisoned people, that art making in prison is often one of the only safe spaces where imprisoned people from different races and ethnicities can come together and collaborate. Most prisons are highly structured and racially segregated places. So much so that like in California prisons, Black imprisoned people shower at the same time, white imprisoned people shower at the same time. Like they're actually separate times for them to shower. They eat at different times in different places. And so they're highly structured around keeping races separated. And that really does benefit prison staff, because it keeps people like kind of fighting among each other in these, separate groups. And so people don't organize around like the very conditions that keep them all incarcerated. But art becomes this like really interesting, safe space where people will collaborate and build friendships across racial and ethnic differences.
We have a question from Meryl. How do you as a curator view it to show this work within the walls of the white art space in a dominant space between walls with a roof versus showing this work in a public space?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, there's been, like I said, several projects around this. Like I've collaborated with Aperture Magazine on Prison Nation, which is like all focused on photography and incarceration. I did much smaller version of an exhibition at a community center in the Bronx. And this is a community center that also is a multi-service organization where a lot of directly impacted people and their family were coming through. And it was kind of, the walls were kind of open, and the wall, and it was also, the work in some ways was made more vulnerable too, because it was kind of like these unguarded spaces. This, I think, having it at PS1 is highly significant for almost all of the artists in the show, who would say, many of them, you know, this is like a dream come true. So for me, it's not just about me, it's about the artists who are like really, some of them are deeply invested in their professional development and they want to become working artists. This kind of platform and the media coverage that the exhibition has received has been incredibly rewarding for them. Many of them have been commissioned to do new works. They have had works purchased. They've had gallerists do studio visits, and I put studios in quotations because some of them don't have like working studios, but they have, you know, and we're also talking about during a pandemic time. So there's Mary Baxter, the sonic artist I mentioned, she's now moderating a series called Chosen Family that airs every Thursday. There's going to be one this Thursday, every other Thursday on PS1's website, where she's interviewing and engaging the artists in the show. We're able to create a non-residency fellowship out of PS1 for directly impacted artists. Tamika Cole is like the first to receive it. So I just say that the white art space, which is often used in kind of a derogatory terms, has become this really important launching pad for many of the artists to be able to expand their aesthetic vision, but also to be recognized as exhibiting artists.
Mm. And Zara has a question. What's your experience around researching art made by youth who have been incarcerated?
Yeah, so there's a well-known organization called Artistic Vision that does a lot of impressive work with directly impacted youth in mainly Boston and the New York area. And that, you know, I bring it up in the book. You know, I think that there are different issues at stake when you're talking about people, because I mean, so I have this idea about what it means to be a consenting being, and especially when you think about collaborating with imprisoned artists or imprisoned people. When you're in prison, you are unfree, and so I argue you can't consent. If you're an unfree person, even if you say, yeah, I want to participate, like legally you can't consent. So what does it mean when you're collaborating with someone who's like unfree, who legally can't consent, and they're being held in captivity? And I think those issues are even more heightened when you think about someone who is not an adult and they've been removed from their guardian, and the state is now their guardian, and they're sometimes, as part of their the conditions for their release, or conditions for, you know, reduced sentence, they are expected to participate in certain kinds of programs. So I think that there's a lot of, I'm not saying that those programs are doing anything damaging. I'm saying that there's just a lot of complexity around what it means to work with imprisoned children.
Okay, I think those are all the Q&As that we had there. I have a question around the issue of exploitation. And do you struggle with trying to navigate understanding of when an artist is feeling exploited, or can even understand, because they're in a state that would be different were they not incarcerated? I guess it's more just a general question about exploitation and the voyeurism of the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I have an ethic of care that's very important for me that put into practice working on this project. That was all about, anything that I wrote, if at all I could share it with people before it came out, I did that. I had a lot of back and forth with people about how I described them, their work, the conditions of their imprisonment. I think exploitation, the idea of exploitation, I mean, prisons are fundamentally structured around inequality. So it's exploitation writ large. It's just everything about prisons is about inequality and reproducing inequality. So you can't avoid that, the very foundational nature of prison, which is to reproduce social hierarchies, devalue certain lives, create the conditions for what Ruthie Wilson Gilmer calls the premature death of certain people. And so I think the idea of exploitation is just something that there's various iterations of it that gets exposed and explored by me as in a scholarly way, and by the artists and the work they do. Like James Huff's work that I showed, I Am the Economy, where it's about his own corporeal being being used to fuel punitive systems. Ryan David asked a couple, I haven't read it, but I see that in the chat there's a question.
Oh, you know what? I've been looking at the Q&A, and then we have this in the, right, we have this in the chat. Right, so I've been wondering, Ryan asked, I've been wondering if you had to engage with prison staff directly over the course of the project and what that experience might have been like. How were your research processes and methods received by administrative staff or corrections facilities? I don't know if this is many questions or one, but so you could see the questions as well, yeah.
Yeah,
so
yeah. It was hard for me to read them and answer, but now I just took a moment to look. Love the question, Ryan. And the project grew. First of all, I think it's important to know that this is a project that did take a decade to do, and I don't think it could have been done in a shorter time frame, because so much of how the project got done was through building relationships, and those relationships take time to it takes time to be introduced, to build trust, and so I did interact with various prison staff at different kinds of facilities. And one of the things that became very clear to me is that prisons, even prisons in one state, they operate so differently. Like, there's not the across the board is that people are being held in punitive captivity, but how the actual prison functions is, each prison is so different. And there are prisons where the staff members were very nonchalant about my presence. There were prisons where people were more curious and asking questions. There were prisons where it was really clear that I was being just shown a very limited kind of window into what's happening in those facilities. So there's not one answer to that. I think, many prison staff members are not interested in art, or they don't feel, maybe they don't feel like they have the vocabulary to talk about what's happening. And so there's a way that I think that there were kind of messages and things that are being coded in some of the art that kind of went over the head of imprisoned people, went over the head of the prison staff, or that they were just busy worrying about security details and other issues, moving populations literally around the facility. So I never got any kind of, I got some like maybe suspicious looks or curiosity, or people kind of curious, but never anything that was what I would say was a kind of negative response to my presence. The only kind of, I think, time I felt like there was a door shut was one organization that I think, you know, kind of was promoting itself doing a certain kind of work. And maybe it was based on some past projects that they were able to get funds for, but they really weren't doing, at the moment that I was scheduled to visit them, they were going to facilitate my visits, this nonprofit, and then they canceled. And I think they were partly canceling because they didn't really have the programming running that they have been promoting. And so I didn't, you know, my approach wasn't to like try to harm and out this organization. I literally just didn't include them in the larger research project.
Okay, thank you for pointing that question out. Well, we have 5 more minutes. Do we have any more questions? It doesn't look like we do.
Well,
But,
the questions that have been asked have been fantastic. So I really appreciate the engagement of your community, you know.
yeah, yes. Well, we've been really appreciated having you. There's been so many comments of gratitude for how wonderful it is to have you here. So we really appreciate your sharing your work with us.
Thank you. And I look forward to the class visit on Friday, the virtual class visit.
Yeah.
Have
Sounds
a good
good.
evening.
Okay.